Well, here we are. This is hopefully the moment that you've all been waiting for. Perhaps at some point during our evolution online class, somebody's come up to you and said, "Oh, just be nice to the bald man. Let him talk about evolution." Well, let's just be clear. A couple things. First of all, right? One, I am not here to promote any agenda at all other than the agenda of science. So remember, science deals with physical evidence. That's what we look at science when we come up with any hypotheses that then need to be tested over and over again to become a theory. Just to be clear again, a theory is a statement made in science which has never been disproven. So we can think of something like gravitational theory that doesn't get people upset. That gravitational theory is a theory in science that has never been disproven. Now, perhaps you have somebody whispering in your ear, "Oh, there's scientists out there that don't believe in evolution." That is absolutely true. Just like there's scientists out there that don't believe in gravity or gravitational theory. Don't believe me? Go look at the University of Durham. There are scientists out there who do not believe in gravitational theory, and they are trying to study it to try to figure out what they believe is actually pulling objects towards the center of the earth. The point, though, is that we always keep our minds open as scientists to new evidence, but we also look at the massive amount of evidence to try to draw conclusions about the world. Just to be clear, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. And that's why we talk about it in science class, because in biology, we talk about the physical evidence that leads to the biological systems that we see today. You might also hear somebody say something like, "Oh, that's evolution, that's just somebody's theory." Remember again, theory, science, never been disproven by physical evidence. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the physical evidence that we have for evolution today. I won't go through each one of these today. I thought I would break it up into smaller bits for you. I'm sure sitting and listening to me isn't high on your priority list. So, one of the first pieces of evidence that we have for evolution is the fossil record. Remember from ninth grade environmental science that fossils are found in sedimentary rock. Remember that rock can be dated using different radioactive isotopes so we can determine how old the rock is. Not only that, but inside that rock are the embedded bones of other animals, animals that do not exist on Earth today. Remember, we can determine the age of those animals by using carbon-14 dating. So we can actually figure out how old these fossils are that are embedded in the earth. And when we look at these fossils, we can see things like how things were actually laid out in terms of a body scheme. What type of feeding did organisms have? How did they move around? Were they solitary organisms, or were they organisms that lived in groups? Remember things like this. We can see like the fossils of giraffes, and we can actually see short-necked giraffes, medium-necked giraffes, and long-necked giraffes, and then we can actually determine the date that these things actually existed. So the fossil evidence is kind of a really big key. It provides us a picture of organisms from the past and what those organisms actually looked like. When we look at some of these organisms of the past, we can see that the organisms that are on Earth now are different than the organisms that we see in the past. And in fact, we can see organisms that have actually evolved from one species into another. Here we're looking at the evolution of the whale. And that's right, kids, whales, the ancestors of whales, Pachycedons, actually walked on land. They actually walked on land, and we'll talk more about vestigial organs and the pelvis and the femur that's actually found inside modern day whales in a little bit. But it's a classic example of being able to look at an organism, see the actual fossils, determine the age of the fossils, and then see how that organism actually evolved over time. We can also see lots of similarities in organisms all across the world. Homologous structures are structures that are very similar in organisms that are related to one another. So if you look at the human arm and the whale flipper, right, both mammals, you can see it's very similar bone structure there. And we can see that throughout many mammals here on Earth. But then we can also see organisms that are not closely related to one another, but because they inhabit similar niches or similar environments. They evolve the same types of structures. Look on the bottom right there, and you can see the feathers on the wing of a bird, and then you can also see the wing of a bat, basically having the same type of structure to allow them to fly through the air. So if you look at this, here's some examples for evolution. I think that's like some sort of narwhal looking thing up top there. We got a shark in the middle, and then we got a little dolphin there at the bottom. If I look at these, I can see the flippers, I can see some gills, right, on these organisms. These are similar, and I would say that these organisms are pretty closely related. So this would be an example of homologous structures. But look at this. Here's organisms that are actually fairly distantly related from one another. You can see a fruit bat, a dragonfly, Canadian goose that sometimes leaves poop out on the Pencrest fields. You can see a moth and a hummingbird, fairly distantly related organisms, but yet they've evolved similar wing structures and actually similar patterns of flying to help them fly through the air. That's an example of an analogous structure. Structures that are similar in organisms that really aren't that closely related, but they do similar things and they have similar functions. Whenever I think of evolution, this is the one that I think is absolutely fantastic. It is such an amazing piece of evidence out there for how species have changed over time, and they're called vestigial organs. Vestigial organs are organs that we actually see today in our bodies and in the bodies of other organisms, but yet they have no real use. But they resemble structures that did have a use in our ancestors. So if you look at something like the very bottom of our spine, you can see that we have a sacrum and a coccyx. Many scientists believe that that was the beginning of a tailbone that we see in many vertebrates. That's a good one, but it's not as good as these. The wisdom teeth that you guys have, perhaps maybe you've gotten them pulled. Wisdom teeth were an extra set of molars. We don't need them now, which is why we get them pulled out, because they come in crooked all the time because our jaws are so small. But our ancestors did use that extra set of molars for digesting plant material. If you look at the human appendix, some scientists say that it might have a little function in immunity today, but many scientists believe that it was a reservoir for bacteria to allow us to digest fibrous material in our ancestors from over 1 million years ago. If you don't like those examples of vestigial organs, these are things that, hey, they may have worked back in the day, but they don't work now. Look at the whale. Certain species of whales actually have a pelvis. A pelvis. Some even have femurs. That's the leg bone. Why on earth would a whale have a pelvis? Why on earth would a whale have a leg bone? These structures suggest that although whales don't use them today, their ancestors did, and in fact we have the fossil evidence that can back that up. If you ever wanted to take a little side trip down the rabbit hole of the internet, you should look at whale evolution. The evolutionary evidence that we have for whales is really overwhelming and quite interesting to look at. Another piece of evidence that suggests that all organisms on Earth are related to one another and descend from a common ancestor is something called comparative embryology. And you may hear the term, if you study science in college, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Don't get scared with that. All it means is, as organisms are in the embryo, organisms that are related to one another oftentimes look very similar to one another. Take a look. I know it's hard to read that on that picture there, but if you look, it's a salamander, a human, a rabbit, a chicken, and a fish. And look at that top row. At the very beginning of development, all of these organisms look very, very similar. And in fact, it gives us another piece of evidence that perhaps organisms are all related to one another and evolved from a common ancestor. I'll simply let you take a look at this. This is human development over time. I would say if you look where it starts to go from orange to red, you can see the embryo of a human that resembles embryos of many other organisms as well, suggesting again that we have lots in common with other organisms here on Earth. This is the point in the program where I think I'm going to wrap up our first part of physical evidence for evolution. In our next part of physical evidence, we'll look at the biochemical evidence that links us all together. I'll also try to answer the question when somebody's telling you, hey, evolution says that we came from monkeys from the zoo. I don't believe that. Well, we did not come from the monkeys in the zoo. Oh, that's because you're saying we came from the monkeys on the African plains. No, we did not come from those monkeys on the African plains. Oh, you mean chimpanzees? No, we did not evolve from chimpanzees. We will get to that part of the story as we move through our next pieces of evidence for evolution. Hope this made sense. We'll try to give you some other pieces of evidence to look at and other ways to digest this information, and I'll see you online real soon. Thanks a lot.